My daughter is 4 years old, and last week she drew this. Now, I think this drawing is great. And yes, like any 4-year-old's drawing, it lacks things like three-dimensionality, but the deficits in technique, I think, are made up for in charm. I'd say this character comes off pretty effectively as a goofball vampire. And the challenge in this video is to bring this design up to production level art, and we'll see what we learn along the way. One thing I really like design-wise about the head is that the facial features are pushed to the upper third of the head shape. See, a human being's eyes roughly line up with the center of the head, to leave room for our brain. Removing that space helps the character look less intelligent. So to get my feet wet with this character, I need to see if I can capture that same sense of goofiness. That's integral. If I miss it, I have to keep trying until I get it. The eyes here being two different shapes, that is such a kid choice. A more experienced artist probably wouldn't do that. I think something like that can easily be trained out of us. So this exercise is a good reminder for me that oddball choices like that are still on the table. Alright, so what I drew is close, but I feel like it should be warped, more like this, to be more faithful to the offbeat nature of that head shape. And that relates to this other shape bad habit that's so easy to fall prey to. Let's call it symmetry by default. Symmetry is a perfectly viable option, but consider the idea that symmetry, by nature, is redundant. And you might not want too much redundancy in your character designs, especially not on a character with as few shapes as this guy. Introducing some asymmetry can really help your shapes look more interesting. And from my experience, it usually has to be a conscious choice. The autopilot in us tends to default to symmetry. By the way, I'm using the new Wacom One tablet in this video. This is the tablet I use as my backup or travel solution when I don't have access to my big Cintiq back there. And I'll tell you more about it as we go along here. Let's pivot over to three-dimensionality. I have a simple 3D object here, and from a 3/4 perspective, you can understand the three-dimensionality by going over the form with these cross-contour lines. But when we see this object now from a dead-on front view, despite the fact that this is still a 3D viewport, the three-dimensionality has vanished. For example, I just changed the form, and it now looks like this, but you would have no way of knowing that if all you saw was the front view. And this is what a kid's drawing generally is, a flat front view. Of course, that's not a criticism of my daughter's drawing, she's only 4. It just means that I have to turn these shapes into forms. And you'll have to do this in your art too, so here's some tips. First, I put down my best guess at what I think the shape will be when seen from a different angle. Then I define its 3 dimensions with some cross contours, also adding a little dotted line here that defines the edge of the form. That is where the front plane meets the side plane. This is powerful because now I can pick a light direction and add shading. Here the light source is hitting the front plane, throwing the side plane into shadow. And the edge between light and shadow is simply a matter of how sharp or round the form is. A more boxy form would be harder edged, and a more spherical form would be softer edged. This form is somewhere in the middle. And now that you have some basic 3D planes in place, you're one step closer to imagining how the face could be put on this. Of course, the problem here is, it still looks like a flat face that's just been projected onto a 3D object. Reminds me of 90s video game graphics. And this is a common problem with student work. So here's a head model from a front view and a 3/4 view. Let's look at the line defining the outer contour. As you can see, these lines really change based on the view. For example, you get this classic indent in a 3/4 view. What you're seeing there is the cavity of the eye socket, which only becomes part of the contour in a 3/4 view. You also get a bounce back out of the eye socket, which the cheekbone is responsible for. So, eye sockets in, cheekbones out. This anatomy is necessary if you want your characters to appear human-like. Here's a very simple character, and it meets those benchmarks. Eye sockets in, cheekbones out. Now, we're seeing him here from more of a front view, so the outer contour isn't really affected by the eye socket. But you can really see it in the shading. Look how simple and clean this form is. The changes in direction are very clear, and I'm practicing seeing that by drawing cross contours. These really enhance your ability to think and therefore design in 3D. Alright, so let's give all that information to this character. And I'm working right over my daughter's drawing, just to show you that you can apply that basic anatomical stuff I just showed you to really any shape design. After all, we see this type of form all over the animal kingdom. We expect to see it, so it'll make your character look more believable. I'm propping up my tablet, by the way, with these little cookie stands. They'll fit in your bag or even your pocket and make any desk you're working on more comfortable. I find a lot of screen tablets have an issue with parallax. The distance between the stylus and the picture is too much, so I was happy that the Wacom one does not have this issue. It really feels like your picture is right on the surface. I mean, I'm not surprised. I've been a Wacom user since the beginning. This is my original Intuos 3 from 20 years ago, and this wasn't even my first one. I had an Intuos 2 before this. Alright, as I continue to work on the value rendering of this head, I want to show you what I'm thinking about. Here on the left, I've got a single plane in 3D. My light source is placed above the object. So I can rotate the plane to face away from the light, which of course is in shadow here. But as the plane now rotates to face the light, look at all these little value changes that happen, corresponding with every little increment of rotation. Of course, this is how real life works. With painting, however, you want to simplify this. So I'll start back where the angle of the plane is just entering the light's influence. Then I'll simply group ranges of angles together. So planes that are facing here to here in relation to the light get this value. And then planes that face from here to here in relation to the light get this value. And then we continue these groupings all the way until the plane is perpendicular to the light, which will represent the second lightest value of the form. Of course, the lightest value being a highlight, so make sure you leave room for that. So there's my finished value rendering, which I've been able to keep simple and readable thanks to this value grouping theory. To directly show it to you in action, let's take a look at the chin. I've simplified that chin into 3 planes, which naturally face 3 different directions. Each direction group gets its own value, and with a little edge manipulation, you have yourself a nice rounded form without having to overthink the value. Being knowledgeable and vigilant over the changes in direction of planes will determine your success rendering. I recommend exercises like sculpting to help wrap your brain around the concept of planes changing direction in 3D space. That's why I'm always referencing models like this. I find these planes so useful. In fact, I've gone ahead and made a 7-hour class about these planes, which you can find at marcobucciartstore.com. So now I'm going to do a full 3/4 drawing of this character that I will then paint. I'm laying out these horizontal plumb lines to keep everything in proportion. And notice when I draw the head shape this time, I'm taking into account that basic anatomy. Eye sockets in, cheekbones out. Now, because a 3/4 view has the opportunity for more depth and perspective, here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to have my gesture just be a straight up and down line. Instead, I'll give the pose a bit of action with this basic C-curve. Constructing the body shapes and forms around that C-curve immediately helps this character to feel like he's in motion. And the way we move is very indicative of our character. So if you're designing a character for any kind of production, it's really helpful to draw poses that are not static. Use the pose, the motion, to help sell the character. I should probably acknowledge at this point that my daughter didn't draw any legs, which I think is perfect because vampires can float. I'm not even sure if my daughter knows that. But anyway, a floating pose makes the arms really feel like they're reaching out for balance. And that's fun. But back to fundamentals, it's always good to test your drawings with cross contours, in this case, to make sure I understand the simple forms I'm putting forth here. Alright, let's start painting up this guy. I think he would live in some kind of castle, so I'm starting with an abstract background of steely grays that simulate that kind of environment. And now I'll lay in some local colors, each on its own layer, to explore this guy's wardrobe. Of course, having layers is nice at this stage because I can quickly iterate and maybe find some unexpected color combinations. As I get some basic modeling in, I like to turn off the line layer to see if that modeling is working and the character is beginning to hold up without the lines. I'm rendering only with shadows to start with, and this is a quick way to get an impression of an overall top-down light source. So if I have a basic cross contour in mind for this character, I'm simply putting the shadows anywhere where that curve turns under. Alright, here's a fun little tip for designing your own clothing textures. On a brand new canvas, I'll start painting in a little floral pattern. My overall idea here being like cheap wallpaper. Vampires love that. I'm sure to work with a very textured brush here because I want that fabric to be very tactile, like those roses are thick embroidery popping off the fabric. Alright, then once I'm done, again, like cheap wallpaper, I'll flip the pattern horizontally so it's mirrored. Then over on my character clothing layer, I'll just paste it in, resize it to taste, maybe copy it a few times, and then play around with the blending modes to find the one that looks best. I think I settled on screen mode for this. And then here I'm doing further rendering underneath that layer to spruce up that cheesy vampire suit further on another screen layer. And with a very textured brush, I'll paint in this golden trim to further define areas of the suit. The collar, the waistline, the cuffs. And of course, for maximum cheesiness, this is a very shiny texture, which means it has a lot of reflection to it. So areas that are reflecting light or catching highlights can be much, much lighter than areas that are reflecting shadow. Also, the darker reflections should be red here because they're reflecting red cloth. Now I'm just starting to put in the light colors on the jacket, and these colors are cooler. That's because I'm lighting this whole thing with a cool light. A cool light will generally leave the shadows warmer in temperature compared to the light colors, which in this case would be a cooler version of red, or something bordering on violet. You can also gray the red down to make it cooler. I have lots of videos on color theory on my channel, and I encourage you to check them out. Another thing I truly love about the Wacom One is that it runs on a single USB-C cable. On the other side of the tablet, you've got your power switch, an input switch, and a toggle switch for touch activation. There is an input for a dedicated power cable, although I never use that. Now, the eyes on this character are just blank holes, so I'm opting for this gradient to bring a little bit of life into them. That gradient simulates how the iris reflects light. We'll need a shadow on the ground to reveal that he's floating. Up close here, you can see all the little color blends that I've got. I'm using a kind of rake style brush for a lot of that. A brush like that allows you to almost weave colors together. And if the brushstrokes get too repetitive looking, I'll just break out my smudge tool and blend things a little bit. Color is one of those things that can distract you from form. So make sure you're checking your work in grayscale to ensure that the form turns very cleanly. That's another reason it's always handy to have a value study to refer to, especially if you're not starting with grayscale in your actual painting, which I didn't. I started with color. So, from unlikely beginnings, we have ourselves a nice little character concept. I feel like this exercise really helped push me out of my comfort zone, and maybe you'd like to give it a try, especially if you're sketching over the holiday season.
Do you remember this drawing you did? Look. It's Daddy's drawing of him.
Perfect.
You like it?
Yeah.
What's your favorite part?
The teeth. But that's not the right way. I actually need to put scribbled hair and hands like this.
How about the hands I did?
They have to be like bended like that.
Which drawing do you like better? Daddy's or yours?
Yours.
Mine?
No, mine.
Ow.